Welcome on this another Sunday after Pentecost. Our lesson for our sermon today is based on the first lesson, which is Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham, here I am," Abraham said. God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go and offer him as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place far off. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together, and Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." "Here am I, my son," he said. And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Then Abraham put forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went, took the ram, and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Here ends our reading for today. To know God's heart, that is the goal of every disciple. To bear the heart of God in word and deed, that is the goal of every eager, mature, and serious follower of Jesus. It seems like they should be easy to do as a Christian. We generally think of ourselves as good Christians if we attend church most weeks, if we engage in some sort of community service or do some good deeds, if we hang around with other Christians, or perhaps take on a leadership role in the church. You know what I mean. We follow what we believe is right according to our sensibilities or the way that we've been raised. We read the scriptures. We attempt to interpret them according to our historic faith traditions. We listen for God's voice, and we believe we know what we are to do. But it is only when we know God's heart that we can make the truly tough decisions, the ones that challenge our status quo and shake up our morals and values. Scriptures are filled with stories about people just like you and me. Those who figured they understood how to be a good person, They knew the things that they were to do, the right things they thought, and they did them. They tried to obey what they believed was God's will. They tried to lead people into battle with God on their side. They instigated rituals and rules for people to follow to make sure that they obeyed God's commandments. And they were adamant about listening for God's voice. But somewhere down the line, they always mess things up. Did you ever notice that about the scriptures? They're filled with people who fail. This is part of what it means to be human. We learn by trial and error, by risk and consequences, and sometimes, despite our greatest efforts, we never seem to get it all right. But there's something else important about the scriptures. God is not interested in perfect people. If God were, not one of the prophets, messengers, or servants in the scriptures would have been chosen to lead God's mission in the world. And yet God chose those imperfect people. No one, except God's only Son Jesus, knows fully God. And yet, God calls upon many throughout the scriptures and still today to carry out the work of love and compassion and mercy and peace in our world. All God requires is that someone have a shepherd's heart. Someone who understands the heart of God. Someone who will carry out God's love and mercy in real circumstances, in real ways. Even when it goes against culture or tradition or upbringing or popularity at the time. In our first lesson for today from Genesis, it's the story of Abraham and Isaac. It looks as though God is calling Abraham to do the unthinkable deed to bind and kill his son. However, the very first sentence of the story tells us that what we read is a test that God makes of Abraham. We know right away from seeing those words, it's a test. We know that what comes next is not going to be a bad thing. It is a test of faith. In biblical times, the test of the Son is made through testing the Father. For this test, Abraham is also Isaac's test. It's a dilemma that will test the heart and faith of both the Father and the Son at the same time. Isaac has been chosen to carry on the covenant line, to be the father of God's people after Abraham. So the test is, does Abraham have the gumption to go through the motions of what God commands in faith? Knowing that God has no intention of letting his son Isaac die. Will he still go through the motions of attempting to kill his son because God said to do it? And the other side of that question, does Isaac have a shepherd's heart? Does he exhibit the kind of sacrificial love that God requires of his special messengers and covenant bearers? Will he be willing to sacrifice himself, his life, to save his people if circumstances call for it, or if God requires it? That's the only kind of leader that God desires. One after God's own heart. The story is actually a kind of coming of age ritual, if you will, a covenant worthiness ritual for Isaac, and both do not fail. Another thing we see in the story, looking closer, is the kind of sacrifice that is called for in this ritual. It's called in Hebrew, olah. It's a kind of burnt sacrifice, which means literally to raise up. When animals were sacrificed, people believed that their prayers, their devotion, their commitment would be raised up through the smoke of the fire in that sacrificial ritual. Their sins would somehow be sent away up to heaven, and they would be cleansed. And the covenant that they made with God would once again be whole or pure. The animal was to be burnt wholly and fully, and as that smoke would ascend or rise up, the connection between heaven and earth would be connected once again and reaffirmed in the promises and commitment and love for God. Through this testing ritual, Isaac would be raised up and consecrated into his new role as a covenant bearer of God's people. In Isaac's actual act of lying on the altar that we hear in the lesson, his willingness to be a sacrifice is shown. God saw his heart, a shepherd's sacrificial and willing heart, because he was willing to lie there. And at that moment, God saves Isaac. And the Abraham and the Isaac together sacrifice a ram that is sent by God for the ritual. The third and final thing that we see in this lesson comes to us in the 4th verse. It says, on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place at a distance. And Abraham said to the 2 men who were with him, "Stay here. And the young man and I will walk up there, worship, and then come back to you." And when Isaac asks where the lamb for the offering is coming from, where is it? Everything else is here. The wood's here. The fire's here. Abraham says, "God will see to it, my son." From that simple conversation in the story, we know that Abraham already knows God's heart, that God has no intention of killing Isaac, but that this is a coming of age ritual for Isaac and a consecration of his status, and Abraham's faith to follow God's will. And that's what leads him to the altar with Isaac. And Isaac's faith allows him to lie upon that altar, not knowing what's happening. And God's heart saves both. The side of God that we see in our lesson today is hard for some of us to fathom. It's a kind of understanding that goes beyond memorizing rules or scriptures or following guidelines. It goes beyond our culture or our upbringing or ideas about what we should or should not do. It requires a kind of intuitive, faith-filled, relational connection with God in which we understand with our hearts the kind of love and kindness and mercy and peace that God's heart exudes. God's heart is a sacrificial heart, always giving. And God chooses servants throughout the scriptures to be covenant bearers. those who bear that same kind of loving, committed heart, a shepherd's heart, a sacrificial heart for others. Jesus tells us that God looks for a shepherd's heart and those chosen to do God's will in the world. God looks for those who would lay down their lives for their sheep. And in the end, God's own Son is sent to serve as the ultimate sacrificial shepherd, proving that God's sacrificial heart is what is required to serve and to save. God saves those with sacrificial hearts for the front lines of God's mission in the world. Sometimes that mission is to foreign countries and to churches abroad, bringing Christians the news and the message of Jesus. We're familiar with that kind of mission throughout the church over the years. But sometimes the front lines are different. Today, in the midst of the worst pandemic the world has seen since 1918, we see signs everywhere of those with sacrificial hearts. Whether they are aware of it or not, these are people after God's own heart. They are willing to put their lives on the line in order to save others. But these are not only people that we hear about in healthcare, but they're people who pray for others, who are sacrificing their time and energy, people who give of limited resources to help others eat, those who drive the trucks, those who run the cash registers, those who open their businesses when there's risk involved. People who risk their reputations to stand up for others who have been persecuted. People who challenge their own assumptions in order to follow God's heart into dangerous and unpredictable situations. This week, I challenge you to learn from the story of Abraham and Isaac and listen for God's voice, to rise to the challenge of God's call, whatever that might be in your life. I challenge you to learn God's heart, to emulate that heart yourself as you immerse yourself in the lives of others around you. Only when we take on the heart of God, the sacrificial heart of Jesus, and ask ourselves what that means in our own lives, can we truly walk the road of Christian discipleship. May God bless you. May you stay safe as you venture forth as a disciple, following God's own heart.